Once again, good evening. If you would turn in your Bibles over to Matthew chapter 6. We will be there in just a moment. Matthew chapter 6. I want to start by asking, do you know who Sir Walter Raleigh is? There are some nods. That's good. You're more up with history than I was before I did some reading on him. However, even if you don't know him, you probably recognize the name. Raleigh, as in Raleigh, North Carolina. The capital of North Carolina was indeed named after him. Sir Walter Raleigh is an interesting case. He financed a lot of failed colonies in North Carolina, most famously the lost colony of Roanoke. His financing of these colonies was to send people over to establish them over in the New World in hopes that they would find fortune and that these colonies would become wealthy and thus make him wealthy. Even though he had good wealth and good standing, he was well known before the royal family and things like that. He was a sir, after all. But he wanted to find fortune in the New World. Later in life, he became obsessed with finding the legendary city of gold known as El Dorado. And it was believed by many Europeans to exist somewhere in South America. And the stories, of course, described entire kingdoms overflowing with gold. Raleigh was convinced the treasure could restore both his fortune and England's power. So in 1595, he led an expedition into the jungles of what is now Venezuela and Guyana. The conditions were brutal. Thick rainforest, disease, insects, heat, starvation, all of those things. And despite all the grand promises, they never found El Dorado. Years later, after falling out of favor with the English crown, and he also spent some time imprisoned in the Tower of London, but he was released, and he was given one final chance to redeem himself. Back to South America, back to go find gold. And so in 1617, he led a second expedition, and that became even worse. His crew became exhausted and mutinous, so supplies ran short. And also, they decided it would be a good idea to attack a Spanish settlement. Don't know why they thought that was a good idea. But they attacked a Spanish settlement. In the fighting, Raleigh's own son was killed. And so, after this another failed expedition, he returned to England. Well, the Spaniards wanted justice for him attacking this settlement. And so King James I did what any diplomat did, and he threw Walter Raleigh under the bus. In all seriousness, Walter Raleigh was executed because of his actions, and his search for treasure, his chase dreams of unimaginable wealth across the ocean, he lost his son, his reputation, his freedom, and finally his life. All for the search for this treasure. And I just have a simple question before I read Matthew chapter 6, verses 19 through 24. And that is, what if his treasure had been in the Lord? What good could he have done? What would have been different in his life? In Matthew chapter 6 and verse 19, Jesus says, "Do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moth and rust destroy, and where thieves break in and steal. But store up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust destroys, and where thieves do not break in or steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. The eye is the lamp of the body. So then if your eye is clear, your whole body will be full of light. But if your eye is bad, your whole body will be full of darkness. If the light that is in you is darkness, how great is the darkness? No one can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and wealth." So as we're continuing to talk about the Sermon on the Mount, we have just talked about the Lord's Prayer, and remember, we treated what came shortly after that, where Jesus talks about fasting we kind of treated that as part of the other section, the section before we talked about the Lord's Prayer. And so we're jumping straight from the Lord's Prayer into verse 19, where Jesus talks about treasure in heaven versus treasure on earth. And of course, the heart is again right at what he has to say. He says, where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. That is to say, wherever your treasure is going to be, your heart's going to chase that. Your heart's going to go there. And if our treasure is somewhere where it shouldn't be, then our heart's also not going to be in a good place. And when our heart's not in a good place, our actions follow. And Jesus has spoken so much on the value of our hearts in the Sermon on the Mount. Not just our actions, but the motives behind them and the heart behind them. What do we think? Do we think like God? Are we pure in heart? Are we, poor in spirit? So on and so forth. And so, as we talk about this idea of treasure, we want to ask tonight, where is your treasure? And Jesus gives us 3 things to think about in regards to being a treasure hunter ourselves. One thing that Jesus teaches us is the futility of chasing wealth. If you were to turn over to Proverbs chapter 23. Proverbs chapter 23. Solomon is speaking, and Solomon knew about wealth, and he seemed to know a little bit about chasing that wealth as well. But he gives some wise advice for all of us to follow. In verse 4, he says, "Do not weary yourself to gain wealth. Cease from your consideration of it. When you set your eyes on it, it is gone. For wealth certainly makes itself wings like an eagle that flies toward the heavens." Solomon said, don't weary yourself trying to gain wealth, because even if you set your eyes on it, it vanishes. And he says, even if you've got it piled up, if you've got it secure, wealth is such that it practically grows wings and flies away. He realized just how fleeting wealth really was. Wealth can so easily be lost. I want you to think about this for just a moment. Have you ever thought about all the ways that you could lose what you have? You could lose everything you have in a natural disaster. We certainly saw that a couple years ago. Whether it's moth or rust that Jesus talks about, or hurricanes, or earthquakes, or wildfires, or tornadoes. Lots of ways for your houses and your barns and your valuable possessions to be destroyed. But there's not just natural disaster. Jesus also mentions theft. He says thieves break in and steal. Someone could, right now, be robbing your house. Or they could, at some point when you're out and about, stop you and rob you for your wallet or your credit card and take your money that way. Or you don't even have to leave the house to be robbed. You could click a link in your email and give someone access to your computer, to your bank accounts, your Social Security, all of that. But wait, it gets worse. Even if you're not actively surfing the internet, and you don't go outside all that often, and you have good security in your house, did you know that your bank could be hacked? And they could take your Social Security, and they could take your account numbers, and they could take your wealth that way. And they could also find your financial information and find your stock holdings, and everything that you own could be gone in a matter of seconds. And yes, we have insurance, we have the FDIC for things like that. But at the end of the day, is that really a sure thing? No, it's not. More than theft, there's also economics. Sure, I've got a lot of dollars, but what if the value of the dollar means nothing? If Like everybody says is going to happen, World War III happens, the value of the dollar could absolutely tank, and then even the mattress, the money that you have under your mattress is worth nothing and has no buying power. Or if you've got all your money in the stock market, we've seen in 2008 and other times, what if the stock market crashes and you lose all your investments? Even more than that, there's legal ways that you could lose all your wealth. I think it's both a little bit funny, but also mainly sad and disturbing, that wealthy and powerful people, when they get married, have their spouses sign a prenuptial agreement, because they recognize that if they get divorced, if they are divorced, that somebody could take up to half of what they own, or maybe even more, if they were to get divorced. Or somebody could sue you for everything you own. They could think of some frivolous lawsuit, or they could legitimately have some kind of lawsuit against you and sue you for everything you own. Or the IRS could decide that you owe thousands or millions of dollars in taxes. Ask Byron about that. There's a lot of ways we could lose our wealth, isn't there? And as ridiculous as that exercise is to think of all the what ifs, they are still realistic. And they do happen to people. And the point is not to make you worry about go lock up your money or go build a barricade or a bunker in your house, but rather just to realize that's not where your treasure should be in the first place. Because even if you keep your wealth in this world, what does it matter? Jesus asked that question over in Luke chapter 12, doesn't he? Luke chapter 12, which we had read just a moment ago. Jesus tells a parable. In verse 15, then he said to them, beware and be on your guard against every form of greed, for not even when one has an abundance does his life consist of his possessions. Don't put all your stock into what you have, Jesus says. And he told them a parable, saying, the land of a rich man was very productive. And he began reasoning to himself, saying, what shall I do, since I have no place to store my crops? And he said, this is what I will do. I will tear down my barns and build larger ones. And there I will store all my grain and my goods. And I will say to my soul, soul, you have many goods laid up for many years to come. Take your ease, eat, drink, and be merry. But God said to him, you fool, this very night your soul is required of you, and now who will own what you have prepared? So is the man who stores up treasure for himself and is not rich toward God. Notice the similar language to what Jesus said in Matthew chapter 6. Don't store up your treasure on earth. Store it in heaven with God. And here's somebody who had all his wealth till the day he died. But as he was counting his pennies, counting his dollars, counting his stacks of money, planning to tear down his barns so he could build bigger barns because his fields had produced so much that he couldn't store all the food that he had, while he's making all these plans and saying, eat, drink, and be merry, everything is good, God says, no, it's not. Tonight you're going to die. And your possessions are no longer going to be yours. They're going to be somebody else's. Whose will they be? Don't know. But it doesn't matter. He wasn't rich toward God. He was rich toward himself. And in a moment, in an instant, all the wealth that he had accumulated didn't matter anymore. We should understand that there is something more sure to chase. Paul talks about this over in 1 Timothy. 1 Timothy chapter 6. First Timothy chapter 6, starting in verse 6. Paul says, but godliness actually is a means of great gain when accompanied by contentment. For we have brought nothing into the world, so we cannot take anything out of it either. Just like the man that we just talked about in Luke chapter 12. If we have food and covering, with these we shall be content. But those who want to get rich fall into temptation and a snare, and many foolish and harmful desires, which plunge men into ruin and destruction. For the love of money is a root of all sorts of evil, and some by longing for it have wandered away from the faith, and pierced themselves with many griefs. Then he says over in verse 17, what about those who are already rich? Don't try to chase money. There's something more sure to chase, Paul says. But what about those who are already rich? Paul says in verse 17, instruct those who are rich in this present world not to be conceited, or to fix their hope on the uncertainty of riches, but on God, who richly supplies us with all things to enjoy. Instruct them to do good, to be rich in good works, and to be generous and ready to share, storing up for themselves the treasure of a good foundation for the future, so that they may take hold of that which is life indeed. Paul says, you want to store up treasure? Even rich people, you've got treasure stored up on earth. He says, that is uncertain. Don't fix your hope on the uncertainty of riches. Instead, what you should do is be rich in good deeds and be generous. And by doing so, you're storing up treasure in heaven that is sure, that is a good foundation for the future, so that they may take hold of the life indeed. So there's something more sure to chase, and that's what Jesus is telling us. If we chase wealth, it'll sprout wings and fly away. It'll never stay. Even if you do have it, you can't take it out of this life. Wealth will always betray you. But Jesus also talks about the power of generosity. And you might think, well, Micah, where does he talk about that? Let's go back to Matthew chapter 16 for just a moment. Matthew chapter 6. In verse 22, he says, the eye is the lamp of the body. So then if your eye is clear, or some translations say if your eye is good, your whole body will be full of light. But if your eye is bad, your whole body will be full of darkness. If the light that is in you is darkness, how great is the darkness? Jesus is talking about, I believe, generosity here. And you might say, well, how? Well, he does so through a Jewish figure of speech. And I'll show you this. In Deuteronomy chapter 15 is one place that we'll look. Deuteronomy chapter 15. Starting in verse 9, it says, beware that there is no base thought in your heart, saying, the seventh year, the year of remission is near, and your eye is hostile. There's that phrase, bad eye there, toward your brother, and you give him nothing, that he may cry to the Lord against you, and it will be a sin in you. You shall generously give to him, and your heart shall not be grieved when you give to him, because for this thing the Lord your God will bless you in all your work and all your undertakings. Here we see that the idea of a bad eye or a hostile or stingy eye is someone who is greedy, is someone who is holding on to their possessions, somebody who is not willing to share with their brethren. We see this also in Proverbs chapter 28. Proverbs chapter 28. In verse 22, it says, a man with an evil eye hastens after wealth, and does not know that want will come upon him. Here again, evil eye is talking about somebody who is greedy, who is stingy. And then in Proverbs chapter 11, Proverbs chapter 11, we'll get there in just a moment. But I want to just say real quickly, this Jewish idiom for generosity is good eye, and the counter idiom would be that bad eye means that you're greedy, that you're stingy. And so what Jesus is saying is, your eye is the lamp of the body, your eye is kind of what we say the window to the soul, right? And Jesus says, okay, if you have a good eye, if you're generous, then your whole body is full of light. But if you have a bad eye, a stingy eye, a greedy eye, then your whole body is full of darkness. And so what Jesus is saying here is the type of person you are with your money, with how you think of your possessions and where your treasure is, affects the rest of your life. And so in Proverbs chapter 11 and verse 24, it says, there is one who scatters and yet increases all the more. And there is one who withholds what is justly due, and yet it results only in want. The generous man will be prosperous, and he who waters will himself be watered. So a general truth that we find in Proverbs, not just in this passage, but other passages in Proverbs as well, is that generous people prosper and greedy people waste away. That is a general truth. That's not to say that that always happens. We recognize time and circumstance and all the things of God's wisdom come into play there. But more importantly, I want you to turn to Proverbs chapter 22. Proverbs chapter 22. Here it says, he who is generous will be blessed, for he gives some of his food to the poor. This goes back to us talking about the Beatitudes. What does blessed mean? It means that they are favored by God. When we are generous, when we give to the poor, when we are free with our own possessions and don't store them up in our hearts and make them our own treasure, but our treasure is toward God, then God favors us. And yes, sometimes that means that we prosper here on earth, that we have more wealth to share, but that's not the point. The point is not to have a relationship with God so that He's going to give us money, because we know that money is fleeting. We have a relationship with God for His favor. If we have physical blessings in this life, great. Let's share. Let's continue to be generous. But more importantly, it's about who God has favor with. And this ties back in with what Jesus had just talked about, doesn't it? Over in Matthew chapter 6, remember how He just said, whenever you fast, don't put on a gloomy face as the hypocrites do, for they neglect their appearance so that they will be noticed by men when they are fasting. Truly I say to you, they have their reward in full. And then in verse 18, your Father who sees what is done in secret, if you fast properly, if you fast toward God and not to be seen of men, your Father who sees what is done in secret will reward you. Those people, the hypocrites that Jesus talks about, their treasure was being seen of men, the praise of men. And they have their reward in full, but that again is fleeting, and that ultimately doesn't matter. But Jesus says, your treasure should be with God. You should want to have favor with God. And so He's already talked about it in the previous section, and He's doubling down here. Don't let your treasure be in wealth. Let your treasure be in God and His favor, in a relationship with Him. And generosity will help us with that. Generosity will help us to let go of the treasures of this earth and store up treasure with God. Jesus also talks about the impossibility of divided loyalty. He says, no man can serve two masters. Either you're going to love the one or hate the other, serve the one, despise the other. And then he says you cannot serve God and wealth. There's his application. Money and God, you can't serve them both. They're different masters. They have different goals. Cannot serve them both. Over in Romans chapter 16, we understand this principle of slavery as Paul explains it to us. Romans chapter 6 and verse 16. Paul says, do you not know that when you present yourselves to someone as slaves for obedience, you are slaves of the one whom you obey, either of sin resulting in death, or of obedience resulting in righteousness? So this principle that Paul lays out, you're slaves of whomever you obey. Okay? Well, you would think, how can I obey money? Money doesn't talk to me. And yet, that desire, that greed, wealth itself can become a master. And when Jesus says you cannot serve God and wealth, understand that serving God eventually gets in the way of accumulating wealth. It does. And we need to understand that. We can understand it in a few different ways. One, think about, I could work more hours if I didn't have to be at church on Sunday and Wednesday. I could accumulate more pay or do whatever my job entails, make more money if I didn't have to be at church on Sunday and Wednesday. I could invest more money in whatever I wanted to do and whatever I wanted to build up, whether it's stocks or bonds or trust funds or whatever else. I could invest more money if I didn't have to give every first day of the week. I could accumulate more possessions if I wasn't expected to be generous and share. And I could be more advanced in my career if I didn't have to pay so much attention to my spouse and children or to other people. And the list goes on and on. Serving God gets in the way of making money and accumulating wealth. And so, if your treasure is truly in wealth, suddenly you find that those things that you did all your life, you went to church, you studied the Bible, you paid attention to your family, you were kind, you were generous, those things aren't important anymore because they get in the way of your goal. On the opposite side, we understand that when we are serving wealth, that gets in the way of us serving God. Because God tells us to be generous. God tells us to help people. God tells us to spend time worshiping Him and serving Him. And all the things that we do to be pleasing to God, they are counter to each other. They are opposed to each other, and they always will be. Paul talks about this idea over in Colossians chapter 3. Colossians chapter 3, starting in verse 1. Paul says, therefore, if you have been raised up with Christ, keep seeking the things above, where Christ is, seated at the right hand of God. Set your mind on the things above, not on the things that are on earth. For you have died, and your life is hidden with Christ in God. When Christ, who is our life, is revealed, then you also will be revealed with Him in glory. Therefore, consider the members of your earthly body as dead to fornication, impurity, passion, evil desire, and greed, which amounts to idolatry. Paul says you need to keep your eyes on the things that are above, the things pertaining to Christ, where Christ is seated, those spiritual things, those spiritual ideas, not on the things that are on the earth. Your eyes can't be above and below at the same time. I guess unless you're cross-eyed. No, seriously though. Your eyes cannot be above and below at the same time. You cannot have your eyes fixed on heaven and the things that matter to God and all the frivolous things of this earth. Greed and lust and desire. You can't do it. It's interesting here that Paul says greed amounts to idolatry. If you love money, you've made money your God. Or I think about what Paul said about some men in Philippians, that their God was their appetite. Sometimes our greed can be our God. We cannot chase the things that are on this earth, the things that are passing away, and the eternal things as well. In Matthew chapter 13, Jesus talks about this idea as well. Matthew chapter 13 and verse 22. Matthew chapter 13 and verse 22, as Jesus is telling the parable of the sower, remember the thorny soil. He says, "And the one on whom seed was sown among the thorns, this is the man who hears the word, and the worry of the world and the deceitfulness of wealth choke the word, and it becomes unfruitful." If we're trying to serve God, our fruitfulness will be choked out by pursuing wealth. That's what Jesus says. The worry of the world and the deceitfulness of wealth chokes out our fruitfulness. And the only way to bear fruit, the only way to be fruitful, is to get rid of the thorns in our hearts. If our hearts are the soil, we got to get rid of the thorns. How do we get rid of the thorns? Well, we move our hearts to where our treasure is, right? We get rid of the thorns when we put our treasure in the right place. And that's how we bear fruit. But you cannot have a divided loyalty. You cannot say, I love God and I'm all about worshiping Him and I want to be a great Christian, and also be greedy and be stingy and love wealth. And so Jesus challenges us all. We recognize the necessity of possessions, the necessity of money. And Jesus talks about, yes, we can use our money wisely, we should be good stewards. That doesn't mean we get rid of everything and just... No, possessions can be used for God's glory too. But we have to be careful. That's not our treasure. So I'll ask you again, where is your treasure? Your treasure could be in gaining wealth, in accumulating wealth and being rich on this earth. And Jesus says that's futile. The whole Bible says that's futile. Won't work for a number of reasons that we've already talked about. Or your treasure could be in the praise of men that Jesus has just talked about. And yea, you have your reward in full. Men are praising you. But how quickly that fades. And how quickly that will go away in the judgment. You could have your treasure in a relationship with a certain person, or you could have your treasure in a number of other places. But the only place where your treasure will actually accumulate and do you well and have a solid foundation is in God. That is the only treasure that matters. So again, in Matthew chapter 6, do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moth and rust destroy, and where thieves break in and steal. But store up for yourselves treasures in heaven, where neither moth nor rust destroys, where thieves do not break in and steal. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. Over in 1 Peter chapter 1. 1 Peter chapter 1. Notice the language that Peter uses, starting in verse 3. Blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, who according to his great mercy has caused us to be born again to a living hope through the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead, to obtain an inheritance which is imperishable and undefiled and will not fade away, reserved in heaven for you, who are protected by the power of God through faith for a salvation ready to be revealed in the last time. Peter says if your relationship is with God and Christ and that's where your treasure is, then you have an inheritance waiting for you that is undefiled and imperishable and will not fade away. And he will later go on, and the Bible writers later go on to say, and that inheritance is sure. It's going. God promised it. It's not going to fade away. It's not going to be taken away. It can't be stolen. God promised it. It is guaranteed. So we ought to think about the things that matter most to us and what we are striving for in this life. Are we striving for an inheritance that fades away and is destroyed and means nothing? Or are we looking for an inheritance that is imperishable and undefiled and reserved in heaven for us? This evening you may have heard some of these things and be pricked to your heart, thinking about how you stand with God. And if you need to obey the gospel, or if you need to make things right, we're going to be singing this invitation song, and it's an opportunity for you. So if you have any need this evening, won't you come while we stand and sing?